had a 4-hour warm-up. Our next speaker is the person you've all been waiting for. He's even had a blockbusting film made all about him. He's Britain's bravest and best historian. He's David Irving!
Giving the talk is very difficult. The most difficult part is building a bridge to the audience before it actually begins. And this little talk here by Madam has reminded me of an episode back in Hamburg in the 1990s, 1980s, 1970s back. There's a Schneekatastrophe, a snow catastrophe. Cows are being buried up to their rooftops. And I'd been hired to give 3 talks in the Hamburg Ruderklub, a restaurant overlooking the lake. 3 talks, and the audience came 3 times, and I spoke each time. And the final talk, there was somebody sitting in the front of the audience. I began, and it was just difficult to get the audience's attention because the Schneeraumkommando, a snow clearance squad, came outside the windows and began clearing the snow away, and they started a snowball fight. My audience were constantly looking at it. It was like Wimbledon, like Wimbledon, and I just couldn't get their attention. And finally, one member of my audience actually collapsed and died in front of me, and that was...
What an effect he had!
I mean, I thought, well, that does it. That is absolutely giddy limit. He's collapsed and died, and the Kamerad is gestorben. He's died, and 4 waiters carried in, walked in and carried him out, still sitting on his chair, and I started again, and then the chairman came in and announced the comrade so-and-so had in fact deceased, and he then called for 2 minutes silence, right in the middle of my opening spiel.
Nobody died.
The bridge building. I mean, I just couldn't get started. And then I finally started, and then the medics came in, the emergency medics, and announced that the comrade so-and-so was dead, and the cause of decease was so-and-so, and start again, and then finally points out he left his suitcase. He left his suitcase. He had left his suitcase. In the gap in the middle where his chair had been, there was now a suitcase just standing there. The unfortunate deceased had omitted to take it with him. and I constantly went, and that isn't the end of the story. About 10 or 15 years later, I've told the stories many times in Germany. And I was down at the other end of Germany, down in Munich, speaking to an audience in a beer hall there, as usual, and there was an audience, and at one end there was 15 or 10, 20 people sitting around the table, enthralled, listening to me. And the person, and Mrs. Hess, Ilse Hess, who was kind of bow-faced, masculine kind of woman, she was sitting there. And I told the story, and everybody laughed, everybody laughed, except one man who didn't. And somebody nudged him, and he refused to laugh, and he said, Heinrich, if you don't laugh, I will tell Mr. Irving why you are not laughing. Why aren't you laughing? Heinrich, this is your last chance. Either you laugh now, or I will tell Mr. Irving. This really secret. And at that moment, he then finally said, well, Mr. Irving, I will say why I'm not laughing. That is because the man who died was my brother. Very embarrassing. You have a wonderful country, ladies and gentlemen, in England and Scotland. I've travelled down from northern Scotland, from as far north as you can get, almost all the way down the highways and byways, and every nook and cranny of this country is beautiful. This country that you have, I never realised how wonderful it is until these 3 or 4 years that I've been living up in Scotland, and it is a beautiful country. The bonny banks and braes, the hills, the glens, the mountains, the valleys, everything is absolutely beautiful, and it's been wonderfully organised, and I congratulate you. You've done a magnificent job on this. Particularly you people, I can see there's only whites in the audience. So very well done, ladies and gentlemen. You've done very well. I just say that to begin this. I have not an ounce of hatred in my person. I think this film has been made called Denial. I was thinking the other day they should surely be prosecuted as hate speech, shouldn't it? Yes. Hate speech. Denial. Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about where I come from. I'm going to abbreviate it, of course. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about where I come from, what kind of person I am, what kind of upbringing I had, rather like David Shaler. He gave a very good talk earlier this afternoon. Shaler, like me, he went to a public school, probably a grammar school. Do they still have grammar schools?
Just about.
Just about.
Kent and Yorkshire.
A great thing, a grammar school. And I went to a grammar school in Brentwood, in Essex, back in the 1950s, 1940s. It dates me a bit. Back in the 1950s, the key culprit in my life is a man called the headmaster, Charles Allison. He was the headmaster of Brentwood School. He was very liberal. I remember on one occasion he came into the class, his teacher had failed to turn up. So the teacher had not, we pupils just sat around waiting all day, and he turned up that morning with a bundle of newspapers under his arm. Newspapers in those days were just 5 or 6 pages, not the bulky books they are now, but they were just 5 or 6 pages each. So he turned up with 7 or 8 pages that he'd gone out and bought from newsagents that morning, and he came in and taught us all how to read newspapers, how to spot the lying that newspapers get up. Very interesting, a liberal headmaster teaching us about the lies of the newspaper industry. Right back in the 1950s, that was. Charles Allison. Charles Allison. And the lying newspaper, what the Germans call die Lügenpresse. Lying journalists. They've existed for the last 50 or 60 years, and we can't get over it. In fact, my mother, in 1947, I remember my mother looking at me when I was reading the Daily Graphic, which was a newspaper that existed in those days, the Daily Graphic. For several days it ran newspaper articles about the Flying Enterprise. The Flying Enterprise, you know what the Flying Enterprise was? It was a ship. A ship that was battled manfully through from Norway to Aberdeen or something like that, sinking the whole time. It was heavily listing, had taken all its water on board, and the crew had abandoned ship, except for the captain. The captain stayed on the...
Captain Carlson.
Captain Carlson. How do you know that?
I remember.
You were in Coventry yesterday, the day before yesterday, when I told the story?
But I was reading the newspaper, what was that? 60 years ago? 50 years ago?
I haven't paid him. Generally, he knew Captain Carlson was the captain on the ship. And my mother, after several days, she gets very worried, and she said, the government is trying to keep something from us. The government is concealing something. And they planted this story to distract our attention. That was what my mother told me back in 1947. She knew even then that governments have days in which to bury the bad news, just like Tony Blair at the time, 9/11. My mother told me that in the newspaper. So I remember the school. It was a very fine school, liberal school, Brentwood School. I finally stayed there until the second year, Upper 6 Arts. As long as you could stay at school, because I was just doing S-level subjects, I ended up with a whole bunch of O-levels, and O-levels they have them down there. They don't have A-levels anymore, do they? S-levels, yes. They call them different, but that's what we did. And ended up with 17 O-levels and 13 A-levels. Just kept on going on. And that was the school. The whole school would march down the High Street in Brentwood High Street to watch a film at the local Odeon Cinema. Films of British heroism like Scott of the Antarctic. Scott of the Antarctic. We all marched down Brentwood High Street to see Scott of the Antarctic. That's what you did in English public schools in the old days, because they were films on British heroism. Nowadays they'll be showing films like Schindler's List, the hatred of one nation for another. And there's a subtle difference, but nobody's spotted the difference. Schindler's List. Do you know who composed the music for Scott of the Antarctic?
Can't remember.
Vaughan Williams had somebody. Yes, Vaughan Williams. He's classic FM's top star composer now. I say that because we had Vaughan Williams there to lecture at school once. He came along to lecture. Vaughan Williams in person, standing in front of us, white-haired and venerable, talking to a packed audience, like 500 or 600 here, 500 or 600 parents, and I went with my mother to listen to Vaughan Williams. The only other time I got excited about a film, well, I mean, there was a film called The Salary of Fear, The Salary of Fear, Le Salaire de la Peur. The Salary of Fear, so two two trucks driving through the South American mountains laden with nitroglycerine where the job was. You remember the film? Yes. That dates you. The Salary of Fear, made with French made with a French soundtrack, and Jean-Paul Belmondo acting as one of the truck drivers, and I'm telling this for a reason. And he was driving one truck, and the other truck was somewhere ahead of us, out of sight, driven by another driver, and Jean-Paul Belmondo at one stage, because the whole point about nitroglycerine is you mustn't shake it, if you vibrate it even, it'll go bang, it'll go poof, with a very big bang indeed. Nitroglycerine, they were sending these trucks through the mountains in South America somewhere to blow out an oil fire, which is burning it out of control in an oil well. And there's Jean-Paul Belmondo, he begins to roll a cigarette with one hand, an open window next to him, and he's rolling the cigarette, and do you remember this in the film? He's rolling the cigarette, and he's with the tobacco on the tobacco paper, and a puff comes through the window, poof, and blows the cigarette out. And the puff is followed 2 or 3 seconds later by a flash, followed 2 or 3 seconds after that by a gigantic explosion. The other truck is blown up into it. And I've never forgotten that, because that teaches you how to make things dramatic when you're writing books. And I use that in my book, The Destruction of Convoy PP-17. Every time I mention a ship which is doomed, a ship whose number is up, I would give it the tonnage, followed by the name of the ship. And so the oil tanker, the oil opener, sailed that morning 18,721 tons, and after a time your reader gets to know that this tanker is doomed, because he's mentioned it. It all goes back to that. But that's not the only reason I saw that film. That film also it was famous because I went there with a number of very small boys from Brentford School, because it was a film in which they had, the word went around the school that they had a woman there who comes out in the open and has a bath in a tin bath. Do you remember that? Well, after a time we were not interested anymore, but that's why we went to see that film. Yes. But that part was gone in seconds. I mean, 10 fleeting seconds. I found the blowing up of the truck far more fascinating. The boom, the puff of the cigarette, the air coming through the window, the lightning flash, and everything being out of sequence. Just like the V2 rocket. The V2 rocket came out of sequence. The first you heard was the approach of the rocket. And then came a flash. Then came the supersonics, double bang. It's all out of sequence. You learn these things as you go through life, and you write history, and you're fitting things in. I remember the V1, the V1 flying bomb. We had a lot of them around London, a lot of them around Essex. In fact, they came in over Essex. V1 flying bomb. This was a thing like particularly from June the 13th, 1944. They were like a Spitfire, but they were just without a pilot. An unmanned Spitfire coming across the horizon at you with no engine, powered by a ramjet engine, which is the first ramjet engine, and it flew faster than any British propeller-driven plane. And the Germans had developed this flying bomb, and the flying bomb was a very, very potent weapon indeed. In July 1944, just a month after it started falling, it caused such damage in Croydon in South London that it was destroying 30,000 homes a day, the flying bomb. I know that from M&G records, which we kept secret at the time. I wrote a book about a flying bomb. And it was I remember asking Field Marshal Mills, I said, do you realize that when that missile came at you, I mean, us small children, we were all cowering under a steel table. It was either a Morrison or an Anderson shelter. Morrison or Anderson, which was a steel table. Anderson, half-inch steel. We had one, and we were kind of naval family. My father was a naval commander, and we were privileged to have an Anderson table, which we children went and hid under there when we heard the V1s coming, it was very, very frightening. You come from all around the horizon. You would hear the sound of the V1. I can't hear the BBC recordings of the V1 coming anymore without having this horrible sense of this horrible chill going down my spine, even now, because it was the deepest imaginable note, organ note. It was like an organ, the deepest imaginable note coming at you from every point in the horizon, and there's only one weapon but it sounds like it's coming from every point in the horizon until it's right overhead. and the engine suddenly cuts out. This deep note which you can hear, and suddenly the engine of the flying bomb cuts out right overhead, or seemed to be right overhead, and then you counted 25. 25 seconds of dead silence until the explosion came. And I said to Field Marshal Milch, years later, when I'm writing my book about him, I got all his diaries and papers, and he was the man who was responsible. I said to Field Marshal, he was Hermann Goering's deputy. I said, you realise that 25 seconds of silence was the most terrifying thing about that weapon? And he said, Mr. Irving, it was not planned. It was not planned. It was an entirely, it was a design fault in the flying bomb. When the flying bomb, how it actually worked was it would fly a certain set distance until it was right over the target area. It would have a little propeller which would rotate in the slipstream, which would rotate a certain number of times until exactly 1,727,000, whatever it was, had elapsed. And that would be the signal to send a signal down to two explosive cartridges under the ailerons, which would suddenly explode. The ailerons would flip up, and the flying bomb would then go into a powered dive carrying its warhead, a 4-ton explosive warhead equivalent, straight into the target area at high speed. And it didn't happen because when those explosive charges blew up, when the explosive charges blew up, then the petrol pipe came out of the kerosene, and it suddenly ran dry. The engine suddenly ran dry. That was why it went silent. And the Germans never realized that. One of those little things. But in fact, the 25 seconds was the most psychologically terrifying, although it didn't actually terrify us children. It terrified the adults far more, because our parents must have been scared stiff by this. Whereas they must have worried about their family and about their children. And women were particularly worried about the flying bomb because of the broken glass. We know that from evidence documents, but all this was kept secret at the time. And so we come back to Deborah Lipstadt. Deborah Lipstadt in her film. She's gone around England now telling people about how awful I am, and she says that I'm a typical bully.
Oh, nonsense.
Yes, and she's gone around all the countries in the world. She's gone to Australia, New Zealand, England now, and the United States, and telling them about how she's a dragon slayer. I understand when they made the film, she didn't particularly want to be played by Rachel Weisz. Rachel Weisz, who's a good looker. I mean, she's Jewish but good looking. I'm anxious not to be guilty of any anti-Semitism at this point. I say she's Jewish but good looking, right? Jewish but good looking. And she plays Deborah Lipstadt, who of course didn't have a whole word to speak throughout the whole trial. She sat in court for 2 months, absolutely stumm. Because there's a particular reason for that, which I can tell you. And in fact, I think Deborah Lipstadt applied to be played. She preferred to be played by Rock Hudson. She wanted to be played by Rock Hudson, but they said, "Madam, well, you can have your way, but we do point out Rock Hudson is now dead." And she said that will make no difference because he doesn't have a word to say in court. But yes. And she went around Israel. She went to Israel then with a list, a big mistake, with a list of all the people who had funded her court action in court, because I brought the libel action against her. She libeled me. In fact, the judge admitted she had libeled me 4 times. The 5th time was the one that she won. But these four libels, the judge admitted they were libelous, and she shouldn't have said them. She went around Israel and she told the Israeli public about the people who had funded the action. Steven Spielberg, the film director, and other film moguls of Hollywood had donated $13 million to her costs. It's interesting, I mean, $13 million, you're told is £2 million. It cost her $13 million, which she never got back. The judge refused her costs. The judge refused her costs because under English rules of the Supreme Court, if you're not a party to the action, one of the actual people involved in the action, then you don't get your costs awarded to you. They have to whistle for them. That's one of the little triumphs that I had. I mean, it's a bitter triumph, of course, but she's gone around not mentioning this fact, not mentioning that she effectually. But the trouble is, they can afford it, that kind of money. They take these huge sums of money, they make these films, they don't care, it's going to lose $20 million. That's the amount it's lost so far. And they don't care because they're serving a cause. In this particular case, They're serving a cause to prove that Auschwitz was the center of all the operations to exterminate the Jews. That's not true. I mean, I'm not going to deny the Holocaust, but I am going to say Auschwitz was not the center of it. Auschwitz was small beer. Auschwitz was just one site where nothing happened, effectively. Heinrich Himmler didn't bother to, the chief of the SS, he didn't bother to visit Auschwitz for the remaining 3 years of World War II. He went the last time in July the 12th, 1942. So it's unimportant. The number of people killed there was less than 300,000 people of all nationalities, dying of all causes, according to the Polish courts. This isn't Holocaust denial, this is a statement of the facts. So they've made this film to boost Auschwitz into the site where it all happened. You fly into Krakow now, the Krakow is the local airport, and you're greeted there by big signs, aren't you? By, who knows this? You're greeted there by a big sign saying, "Welcome to the Auschwitz experience." Yes. Because it's like Disneyland. And you go there and everything is chrome and ground glass and very expensive. And because it's very easy to get to. It's got an airport just less than an hour away. It's got hotels all around. It's got McDonald's. It's got a hot dog stand on the car parking park. Whereas where everything really happened were the so-called Reinhard sites, the Operation Reinhard sites in eastern Poland, 200 or 300 miles away. We go there once every year. I take a group of international tourists with me. We go and look at the Reinhard. We don't bother with Auschwitz because nothing happened there. We go to these Reinhard sites, Belzec, Treblinka, Majdanek, Sobibor. You go there, each slightly different, there's nothing much to see. Sobibor is just a windswept forest with paths through it where you know things happened. We know things happened because we decoded messages from the commandant of Sobibor. October the 14th, 1943, for example, Commandant of Sobibor reports, today 700 Jews have broken out of the concentration camp at Sobibor, and instant police searches to be instituted, looking for all the Jews to bring them back without fail. Very interesting. It doesn't say that it's an extermination site, but there's enough information in that. Sobibor therefore did exist, therefore it did house Jews in large number, therefore they broke out, and there was a mutiny that day, so that story, which is known from all sources, is backed up by the decoding evidence of the British. These decodes are very important documents. And so Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, overrun by the Russians in July 1944. At first they said over 1 million Jews were killed in Auschwitz, in Treblinka. But we now know the actual number of people who died in Majdanek was less than 50,000. So bit by bit the numbers come down. Bit by bit the numbers come down. When we came to the trial, I asked, they had a witness. Their expert witness was Professor Richard Evans. He teaches at Cambridge University, I think. Is he still at Cambridge, I think?
He's at Gresham.
That's when? What?
He's at Gresham. He's the guy in charge of Gresham College.
That's an honours place, that's honours.
Well, the thing is, he's always there at Gresham. If you go to any of the lectures there, quite often he's there. So
Is that at Cambridge or?
He's the provost of Gresham.
he's the one in charge.
The provost?
He's the one in charge.
Last time I heard the word
It's,
provost, I was at Cambridge, Glasgow. I was speaking in Glasgow and we had an audience as big as Zulot in Glasgow a week ago. We had the Lord Provost of Glasgow was having a simultaneous function in the same hotel, the Hilton Hotel. Yes. So the hotel was crawling with security and lots of very suspicious-looking gentlemen walking around with skirts or what they call kilts, and we had a very, very, very big meeting. No, Richard Evans, the one who appointed himself Regius Professor. Regius Professor is actually a rank to be bestowed by Her Majesty the Queen, but he waited long enough, he thought, and he then actually applied to have that rank assigned to him. He's a very unpleasant man. But he was the expert witness of Deborah Lipstadt. And he said in his expert report to the court, he said, I've come to the conclusion there were 4 criteria in order to qualify as an expert, as a Holocaust denier. A Holocaust denier is somebody who minimizes the number of people, Jews killed in the Holocaust. An expert, and a Holocaust denier is somebody who says Adolf Hitler probably had no part in it. And a Holocaust denier is somebody who says Auschwitz is unimportant. I mean, all these actual criteria could be said to a point apply to me. So I got him in the witness stand and I said, Professor Evans, these 4 criteria. In order to be a Holocaust denier, do you have to qualify under all 4 criteria, or is just one sufficient? And he wasn't quite certain what the correct answer was, and he looked at the lawyers, and the lawyers looked back at him, and they remained stumm because they couldn't answer. And I said, go on, answer. And he said, well, one, just one. If one person has one of these criteria, then I will say that he's a Holocaust denier. So I then said, I'll hand you a photograph now. I hand you 2 photographs in a moment. I hand you one photograph now. It's a memorial in Auschwitz to 4 million Jews who've been killed there since the beginning of the camp. You see that, yes. I said, I now hand you another photograph of the same memorial, which has been planted there by František Pieper, the director of the Auschwitz State Museum. This memorial reduces the number to 1.2 million. Is he a Holocaust denier, therefore? I mean, we had a lot of fun in that. We had a lot of fun in that courtroom. We had Van Pelt. Van Pelt was the Dutch. Remember the judge, the Dutch architect giving evidence. I mean, I'm saying this because Van Pelt gave evidence in this, and he was the architect from the Canadian architect from the University of Waterloo, and he's a professor of architecture there. And a few weeks before the trial began, I've been given the tip-off by a firm of New York architects. In fact, he isn't an architect. Van Pelt isn't an architect. He does.
Amazing.
He does.
But they lie.
Well, yes. But when you go to court, you have the chance to ask this in full court. And I then had it straight away. If you go to the transcript, you'll see I say this. I say, Professor Van Pelt, you learned architecture at the University of Van Leiden, I think, and you trained. He says, yes. I said, but you haven't actually qualified as an architect, have you? No, I haven't qualified as an architect. I said, because if you're qualified as an architect, in order to be called an architect, you have to register with a professional body, don't you, of architects? And he says, well, yes, that is true. I said, are you a member of the Royal Institute of British Architects? He said, no, I'm not. I said, are you a member of the Bund van Nederlandse Architecten? He says, no, I'm not. I said, are you a member of the Canadian architectural body, the equivalent? He says, no, I'm not. So I said, in other words, you're not entitled to call yourself an architect in any circumstances, let alone here in court. But you're giving evidence as an architect. He says, well, I don't teach professor of architecture. I teach the cultural history of architecture, the cultural history of architecture. So I said, you're not going to give evidence on the cultural history of Auschwitz, are you? You have a lot of fun in the courtroom. being very careful. You can't go too far. In fact, I said, because you're now calling yourself an architect without actually having registered as an architect, it would be fair to call you a charlatan, wouldn't it? Which is exactly the word they use about Fred Leuchter, a charlatan. And he said, well, yes, so he admits he's a charlatan. But none of this is in the film, of course. None of this is in the film. But what is interesting is at this point the Judge Gray, who was a novice, he was the greenhorn, he should have said, well, Mr. Irving, I appreciate that you're here acting in person, you have no barristers representing you, no lawyers, no anybody. So are you trying to suggest that Professor Van Pelt is not qualified as an architect and not qualified to give evidence as an architect? He should have said that. He should have helped. And then he should have said, are you asking me to disqualify him from giving evidence? He should have done that, but he's great. It's my own fault. It never occurred to me that I had to say that, but it never occurred to me, and Gray didn't say it, and so the case rolled on. In fact, Van Pelt went on to give evidence not only on architecture, he then allowed himself to give evidence on toxicology, on document authentication, and all sorts of subsidiary forensic branches, which would all be branches of expertise, and the judge didn't stand up. Yes?
In the film, it was being suggested that if you had gone for a jury trial, you would have won.
Well, they can suggest that, but we were very happy on both sides that it was allowed to go to Judge Gray. I didn't realise that Judge Gray at that time, shall we say, had he was skewed. He was skewed. I personally was happy that, and also you have to appreciate that had we gone for a jury trial, the whole presentation would have been different. That they would have produced, we anticipate they would then have marched their witnesses into the witness box in Holocaust Auschwitz uniforms like pant pajamas whose stripes in column of 6, and there would have been no end to it. And now they say that they want. No, that's not the reason why it didn't happen.
Well, it was being suggested that Anthony Julius thought it would have been a disaster if you had been allowed to cross-examine Lipstadt. Well, that was what the film suggested.
If I had cross-examined Lipstadt, if I had been allowed to cross-examine Lipstadt, it would have been a disaster. And the actual, I don't.
You do the one.
No, it would have been a disaster for Lipstadt, and I will explain why. Totally unrelated. What you don't know is that there was 6 or 7 interlocutory actions before the trial began. That's a minor trial to discuss certain points of procedure, but usually before a different judge. And there were 6 or 7 of them, with me against Anthony Julius as the lawyer, and I won every single one. Oh yes, including on one specific point where we had caught the opposing lawyers out for having concealed discovery, or concealed disclosure, as it would now be called. Concealing discovery is a very, very severe offence in the rules of the Supreme Court. It's where each side is required, obligated to produce to the other side all the documents relating to the case, so that each side can see if there's anything in the opponent's documents that they can then use. And Deborah Lipstadt, or her lawyers, had decided to conceal certain videotapes which I had been applying for from them in writing 3 or 4 years earlier, right at the beginning of the case. I've been applying for these tapes, and they've written back to me saying that they hadn't seen them, they didn't have access to these tapes. And accidentally, when they returned all my videos and tapes to me one day before the case began, there were 2 tapes too many in my case. They returned me. They had accidentally returned these 2 tapes to me, and these are the ones that I was actually looking for. So I had them, and I went straight before a judge in the Supreme Court. Went straight before a judge, and I applied. The actual application I made was for an order to be made striking out the defence of the defendant Lipstadt, because she had maliciously concealed disclosure, which is the way it's penned in the rules of the Supreme Court. Wait. And then we went the whole way through a whole day hearing before a judge, and the judge at that time, he was Master Trench, and he was a slightly junior judge, and he was very nervous. He knew this was going to be a big case lasting several months, and he didn't want to be personally responsible for striking out the defence, which would have been the end of her defence. She couldn't have submitted defence, so he didn't make that order. And I then said, well, stage 2 is you are empowered, and I have to tell the judge what he's empowered to do. You're empowered under rules so and so and so and so of the Supreme Court. Rules of the Supreme Court, you're empowered to make an order that the defendant who has culpably made a mistake like this, failed to make disclosure, you're entitled to make an order that she now swears an affidavit on her remaining discovery. It's very legal language, but what you're effectively saying is you want her now to swear that everything I've done is absolutely true and above board, and the other thing was an accident, but I swear that everything else is true. And Anthony Julius fought tooth and nails not to have his client make that. Julius said, it was our mistake, the lawyers made this mistake. Actually, it wasn't a mistake at all, it was obviously deliberate. The lawyers made this mistake, and she shouldn't have to, Deborah Lipstadt, and the judge said, no, you are Deborah Lipstadt's lawyers, and you are considered to be all the same. You make the mistake, but it's going to go on her account. And he then granted that order that she should now swear an affidavit. This has consequences. Anthony Julius was very bitter that his client had to swear an affidavit, which makes her look like a guilty party. And he was bitter for the next 3 months until the case began. Now, I couldn't then prove that Deborah Lipstadt had concealed discovery, as it would be called. I couldn't prove it. You're not allowed to try and prove it. You're not allowed to go behind the affidavit at that point. That's what it's called in legal language. You're not allowed to go behind that affidavit. However, you're not allowed to go behind the affidavit until you get that witness who's sworn the affidavit in the witness box in the trial. And then you can cross-examine her and expose her for having concealed discovery. And that would be equivalent to perjury, 4 years prison. So that was why she didn't go in the witness box. Simple as that.
It was being suggested in the film that you would have made mincemeat of any of the survivors and her as well.
I don't think so. I think that my knowledge at that time wasn't as sufficient to to be perfectly frank, they knew more than I did. I learned all about the Holocaust as we went along, and I was forced to learn up a great deal, because the judge allowed the whole case to be skewed away from whether I had deliberately faked history to be skewed towards the angle of whether the Holocaust actually happened or not. And that wasn't actually the case that was at issue. But there was a second reason why Deborah Lipstadt didn't want to go in the witness box, and that is because she probably knew that the following opening dialogue would have happened. Following opening dialogue, I would say, Professor Lipstadt, you're a professor of religion at an American university, is that correct? Yes. You always ask questions to which you know the answers. You're very foolish if you ask questions without knowing what the only answer. So you're a professor of religion? Yes. That would be the Jewish religion, right? Yes. What are the most important prayers that you've intoned over the last few months? Well, a whole catalogue of them. Yes, that's fair. And would it be fair to say that you've intoned the prayer on Yom Kippur last year, which is, I think, 12th of September last year? 12th of September, you intoned what is known as the Kol Nidre. The Kol Nidre. And she becomes then very uncomfortable because she knows what the Kol Nidre says. And I'm then going to hand her, I'm going to make it easy for her, give her the Jewish actual original. We had all this ready, we had all these documents ready to put to her. I'm going to hand her the Jewish text of the Kol Nidre from an approved Jewish source, I think the Encyclopedia Judaica. And then I was going to say, now I'm going to hand you the English translation of that. Is that translation accurate? And that's when it gets awkward, because in the Kol Nidre actually says, they sing it to beautiful music, but it still says these words, that I undertake that all oaths and promises that I have made and sworn in the last 12 months, in 12 months to this date, in 12 months' time, shall be as nothing. They obtain permission automatically to annul all their promises in the coming 12 months. And it's very strange, and there's been a lot of editorials written about it, but I mean, and having done that, I would then turn to the judge and say, I have no further questions of these witnesses. It's pointless asking her questions, because what oath have you sworn this morning? And you swore on this oath, you swore an oath, or can you tell us the court whether this oath actually trumps the Kol Nidre? Of course it doesn't. That's the most solemn. So that was all prepared and lined up, and that's not the second reason why they didn't want it. And my barrister friends who were advising me in the background said, David, if you do that, then you'll mincemeat. You won't eat lunch in that courtroom again. But that kind of thing happened in court. There were many others. How do we get on? Oh yes, I was having her going around Israel. And talking about all the people who put up all the money which they then lost. And then she said, and my lawyers have decided to do what they can to destabilize Mr. Irving in the next few weeks before the trial begins. They use the word destabilize. Destabilize. Now, I wonder, what does she mean by destabilizing me? How is she going to destabilize me? And I found out later on in early September 1999, a few months before the trial began, still under the old rules. And we had the misfortune that one of my four daughters at that time, she died. And we had a funeral, which is very unfortunate as a father to have to do that. And you hate this. At the funeral you have your daughters and all the remaining daughters and the mother and your brothers and sisters. And a big funeral, big family gathering in the flat in Mayfair. And bit by bit that evening, they all left me with condolences, and I was left alone in the flat. And the phone rang. Oh, this is destabilizing. The phone rang. And the voice said, Mr. Irving, this is the undertakers who arranged your funeral for you this afternoon, and so on. And very unusual. We just had a wreath delivered to us. A wreath delivered to your address, and it's in our hands in prison, but it's got a note attached to it. I said, is there a note which identifies the giver? Because obviously if so, it'll have to come straight to us. And she said, yes, Miss Irving, that is what we have. And they brought it around half an hour later. I took photographs, still got the photograph, still got the actual ticket. I destroyed the wreath straight away. It was very expensive, it cost hundreds of pounds. White roses and lilies. And the wreath just said, "Dear Mr. Irving, truly a merciful death. Yours, Philip Bouler and friends." Which means nothing to you, unless you write history. Truly a merciful death. Yours, Philip Bouler and friends. Words merciful death are the first clue. Gnadentod. That was the German operation, code name for the euthanasia killings which went on. 40 or 50,000 people put to death, disabled, for euthanasia, Gnadentod. And poor Josephine, my daughter, was disabled. She suffered a terrible accident a few months earlier. She had no arms and legs, and she was very badly injured. And the note attached to the wreath was signed Philip Bouler and friends. Philip Bouler was the head of the German euthanasia program, and he committed suicide in 1945. And I knew that, and the people who signed the note knew that. Part of that destabilization progress. And it did destabilize me briefly. I went back to the flower shop and I said, "Can you describe the person?" "Oh yes, well, he came around, he was very well dressed. The flower shop is called the Bloomsbury Florists. Bloomsbury Florists. And he might have been from the Mid East or something like that. And he couldn't sign the card. He just dictated the card because he said that he had damaged his hand somehow. So he didn't sign it in his handwriting. And he couldn't pay by card, or he had to or check, he had to pay by cash. He would demand accepting cash. All these little things, I was so overwhelmed by this magnitude, this awful thing, that it didn't occur to me that the Bloomsbury Florists were just 100 yards from Mishcon. Deborah Lipsta's lawyers. It wasn't the two law firms. There was the Publishers Law Firm, Penguin's law firm, and Mishcon. Penguin had behaved impeccably. I mean, they actually wrote me a letter of condolences. They were my opponents in the libel action, but they were the ones who wrote me a letter of condolences as soon as Joseph's death became known in the newspapers. Mishcon, they treated it their own way. I'm sure there's a whole sequence of things I know I know about. That's the kind of thing that happens. However, I'm still standing at the end of all that. That was 15 years ago. Still standing, and the fight goes on, and I'll continue writing the true history as I find it to be true, and I'll continue writing and publishing the books as and when. It just remains to be seen how long it takes to bring back the national press into line again. At present they're out over there hating me and sneering at me and doing all the things you expect of them. But I think I've got enough life left in me to carry on until they come back into line, until the Heinrich Himmler book comes out and the next book and one after that perhaps. And I will do that. Thank you very much for coming.